Let's begin with an ironic truth. For thousands of years, there has been a recurring play with a stale, ancient script. Yet there are always new audiences willing to pay the admission price to watch. That play is titled The Immortal Vows of Empires. There is a strange commonality between a Roman emperor in silk robes, a passionate French revolutionary, and a modern politician in a tailored suit. They are all exceptionally good at making vows. They boldly declare before the masses, "Fear not, dear subjects, our currency is the safest, the government's promise is eternal, and the flourishing future you've dreamed of is right before your eyes." But if you flip back through the dusty pages of history, you will see that history is not a kind old soul, but a ruthless butcher with a particular hobby of slapping the faces of the arrogant. History has proven time and again that those grand promises of forever usually have a shorter shelf life than groceries at a wet market. As it turns out, the collapse of a financial system is never a sudden accident or a stroke of bad luck. It is an inevitable law, a feature hard-coded into the source code of every empire from the very day it was founded. You look at your bank balance on a phone app or admire the crisp polymer bills in your wallet and assume it is a foundation as solid as a rock? Oh no, you are falling for one of humanity's most dangerous financial illusions. The truth is, money has never been a solid foundation. It isn't as hard as stone, as heavy as gold, and certainly not as durable as diamonds. Money, in its essence, is merely a form of packaged belief energy, wrapped in paper or stored as digital digits. When we hold a bill and believe it can be traded for a bowl of soup, the soup appears. But the moment you wake up one morning and that belief has evaporated into thin air, that bill instantly reverts to its true form, a piece of plastic with pretty drawings, nothing more, nothing less. And as you know, the faith of the masses can be more fickle and evaporate faster than an ex-lover turning their back after a breakup. The illusion of eternity is the black hole that swallows the assets of the most naive. We tend to think the system we live in is unique, stable, and unbreakable. But look closely. From the collapse of the silver denarius in Rome to the modern Lebanese pound just recently, the script remains identical. People go to bed as savers with nest eggs and wake up empty-handed. They watch their wages become meaningless and their futures stolen by the very system they once worshipped. Collapse is the rule, not the exception. Therefore, the million-dollar question you need to ask right now is not, will the system collapse? But rather, what will you do to protect yourself when that illusion shatters? History is brutal in that it shows no mercy to the ignorant, but it is incredibly useful for those who know how to look into the mirror of the past. Every great collapse leaves behind crime scene evidence, lessons about what truly protects wealth and what turns to dust when the storm hits. If you observe carefully, you will notice an interesting detail. The survivors of these financial disasters were never the ones who believed the most in the system. On the contrary, the ultimate survivors, those who could still sip wine while the empire was in a panic, were the first skeptics. They are the ones who understand that when the government starts shouting about duty and trust, that is exactly when they should check if they are holding anything of actual value. They don't bet their entire future on paper promises because they know that when trust vanishes, paper is just paper. Real value will always find a way to flee toward assets that rulers cannot forge with a printing press. This first lesson is like a bucket of cold water splashed on the faces of those sleepwalking in a state of false stability. It reminds us, never entrust your entire life to a mere number on a screen. Having soberly realized that the vows of empires often have a shorter shelf life than groceries at a wet market, let's pay a visit to another equally arrogant giant, the Byzantine Empire. If you need a textbook example of how trust can be subtly bled dry, then Byzantium is the masterclass for you. Imagine, at its peak, this empire possessed the gold solidus, a currency that, quite literally, was the iPhone of the medieval world. With a solidus in hand, you could travel from Europe to the Middle East, passing through Asia, and no one would dare reject it. It was so trusted that people accepted it with their eyes closed, without inspection, simply because it was 100% pure gold. However, life is not a dream, and even an emperor's pockets have a bottom. The Byzantine emperors, in moments of being broke from moping around building palaces or invading neighbors, came up with an initiative that we today call the pinnacle of deceit. They asked themselves, why spend a full measure of gold on one coin when I could mix in a bit of lead and copper while keeping the exterior just as shiny? Thus, a silent revolution of dilution began. The legendary Solidus was put on a forced weight loss diet. The gold purity was stretched thinner, mixed with all sorts of cheap alloys, much like how people water down a bowl of fish sauce to serve more guests. The beauty, and the danger, of this game was, at first, nobody noticed. Citizens still went to work, still received their wages in shiny coins, and still believed they held treasures. The emperors were delighted because they could suddenly print more money from the same amount of old gold. But as you know, the market has an incredibly sharp nose for the scent of fraud. It only took a few savvy merchants noticing the coin was slightly lighter or the color a bit duller for a horrific domino effect to occur. Trust, built laboriously over centuries, shattered in a single heartbeat. The currency that was once the backbone of Mediterranean trade suddenly turned into a literal political joke. Prices began to skyrocket because sellers weren't stupid. They demanded more diluted gold coins for the same loaf of bread. Byzantium's economic stability, which seemed eternal, collapsed with every strike of the king's minting hammer. And this was the moment that sorted the smart players in this game. The survivors of this financial storm were absolutely not the loyalists who sat clutching government decrees, believing that the king's gold is best. The real survivors were the first skeptics we mentioned earlier. They were the merchants who, quietly and discreetly, said little but silently hoarded real gold bars, the 100% pure, unadulterated kind, or used their soon-to-be worthless cash to buy land, tangible assets beyond the reach of the financial wizards at the palace. They understood a timeless law. Governments can never resist the temptation to dilute currency when they are in trouble. And when the magic of printing money is deployed, real value will always find a way to escape into assets that the government cannot counterfeit with a printer or a forge. The lesson from Byzantium is a sharp reminder for us today. Don't let the system's shiny exterior blind you. When financiers start talking about monetary policy flexibility or quantitative easing, be alert and check if the money in your pocket is losing weight. The deepest protection doesn't lie in the paper or coin you hold, but in whether you own something with intrinsic value, something that retains its power even if the empire collapses or the emperor vanishes. Land stays, pure gold stays, and your value-creating skills stay. Those are the true currencies that no political hand can dilute. Our journey has only just begun because, after man-made dilutions, history has even more horrific shocks in store from nature, where even if money isn't diluted, death and scarcity will upend every economic spreadsheet. Let's wait and see what the Black Death did to Europe's wallet in the next part. After witnessing the Byzantine emperors surgically thinning out gold coins, we might think humans are the only species capable of upending the financial system. However, history once again laughs in the face of Excel spreadsheets by introducing an uninvited guest from the darkest corners: rats carrying the bubonic plague. This is where we enter a bizarre and bitter chapter of economics, the Black Death. Imagine mid-14th century Europe, operating under a stale feudal order where lords owned the land and peasants were mere cheap pawns. Suddenly, the pandemic struck like a storm, sweeping everything away. In just 4 years, from 1347 to 1351, half of Europe's population was gone forever. Cities fell silent, villages became desolate, and once bustling trade routes turned into wasteland roads. In such a horrific disaster, you'd think the economy would completely collapse into a black hole of despair, right? But no, history always has plot twists that leave economists scratching their heads. In misfortune, there is irony. As the labor force suddenly evaporated by half, a spectacular reversal script unfolded in the market. Poor peasants who previously had to beg for work suddenly realized they were rare commodities. The lords, once accustomed to arrogance, now had to swallow their pride, scrambling to recruit workers with skyrocketing wages and unprecedented perks. Land, an asset once considered liquid gold with exorbitant prices, suddenly became dirt cheap because there weren't enough people to farm it. Abandoned mansions and unplowed fields created the strangest buyer's market in human history. If this sounds familiar enough to make you cringe, it's because we just lived through a 4.0 version of this script called the COVID pandemic. Look at how sophisticatedly history repeats itself. Supply chains broke, the world came to a standstill, and governments began their familiar routine, printing trillions of dollars to keep the machine from paralyzing. A new wave of inequality rose, just as the plague survivors leveraged scarcity to climb the social ladder. During the plague, those holding cash, silver, or even remaining labor power suddenly gained financial leverage they never dreamed of. They could buy up fertile land or luxurious homes at bargain prices from owners who had perished or were utterly desperate. Back to the 21st century, we see a similar scene. While millions living paycheck to paycheck struggle to pay rent amidst an inflation storm, the first skeptics with abundant capital are leisurely snapping up real estate, stocks, and struggling businesses. The lesson here is quite brutal. A crisis is never the end of the world for everyone. It is merely a massive wealth redistribution, where money flows from the pockets of those without reserves to those with high liquidity. As printed money floods the system like a deluge, the value of every cent in a worker's pocket evaporates with every tick of inflation, while the elite's assets swell in value, pegged to things that a printing press cannot create. Pandemic-driven collapse has proven a timeless truth. When the system shakes, old rules are erased. Labor becomes precious when it's scarce, and real assets become the kingdom for those alert enough to hold them. Thus, instead of just praying for the pandemic to end, the financially literate usually ask, while everyone is panicking, what am I holding that has actual value? Because after every pandemic storm, the world's deck is reshuffled. And if you don't have your own reserve room, you will forever be the one breathless, chasing inflation numbers dancing on supermarket shelves every day. And while we are preoccupied with discussing post-pandemic wealth, history delivers another slap to those who believe in the safety of financial giants. Let's step into the next chapter to see how the too-big-to-fail banks in Florence collapsed like dominoes, proving that scale is often just a screen for fragility. Leaving behind the empty fields of the post-plague era where labor suddenly became king, let's don our finest silks and step into the magnificent towers of Florence in the 1340s. Imagine Florence back then not just as a capital of art, but as the Wall Street of the world. Here, legendary banking dynasties like the Bardi and Peruzzi reigned from the heights of power, where a single nod of their heads could decide the fate of entire kingdoms. They were so wealthy that people believed if there was anything sturdier than the strongest city walls, it was the balance sheets of the Florentine banks. This was the birthplace of the sweetest and oldest lie in financial history: too big to fail. The citizens of Florence at that time held absolute faith in these banks. They entrusted everything, from their last silver savings to their entire family fortunes, to these giants, believing that grand scale and illustrious reputation were the ultimate shields. But alas, history was once again preparing a face-breaking punch for those who dared to place blind faith in financial institutions. The collapse began with a character no one expected: King Edward III of England. To fund his lavish wars with France, this king borrowed astronomical sums from the Florentine banks. And then, in a moment of clouded conscience, or simply being broke, Edward III decided to take an action that financiers call a default, but common folk simply call stiffing the bill. When the king declared he wouldn't pay, the giants, Bardi and Peruzzi, already staggering under a mountain of bad debt, began to tremble. In an instant, the dominoes started to fall. Rumors spread faster than a plague. Panicked citizens rushed to the banks to withdraw their money, but all they received were slammed doors and hollow promises. Florence, once a glamorous financial capital, suddenly plunged into chaos, bankruptcy, and ruin. The people realized a bitter truth: size does not equal safety, and a resounding name in the marketplace is worthless when its pockets are empty. The ultimate irony is that this lesson from the 1340s remains perfectly topical even today. Just look at the collapse of Lehman Brothers in 2008, or the frozen account crisis in Lebanon in 2019. The script is old and outdated. Financial institutions are born to generate profit, not to act as protectors of your survival. While the profits are there, they welcome you with a smile. But when the storm hits and they start to fall, they won't hesitate to drag your hard-earned savings into the grave with them to try and save themselves. This is a brutal reminder that reputation is just a coat of paint, while true safety lies in understanding how the system actually operates. Never mistake a bank with a grand headquarters or a corporation with a century of history for being immortal. In the game of finance, survival belongs to those who realize that an institution's promise is only valid until the day they are no longer able, or no longer willing, to keep it. When the Florentine giants fell, the lesson they left us was, always keep a back exit for yourself, and never put all your eggs in a basket labeled with someone else's prestige. And when private banks collapse, people often turn their eyes toward the government as a last resort. But is the government truly a safe harbor, or are they just another player in an even bigger gamble? Let's move on to part 5 to see how, during the American Civil War, both sides competed to see who could print more scrap paper in the name of patriotism. Leaving the crumbling towers of Florence behind, where faith in financial giants has just vanished into thin air, let us take a time-traveling train to the United States in the 1860s. This was a time when the smoke of gunfire didn't just blanket the battlefields, it also choked the money-printing presses running at maximum capacity. Welcome to the dark comedy titled The War of Patriotic Scraps. During the American Civil War, both the Union, the North, and the Confederacy, the South, faced an impossible dilemma. Large-scale war is terrifyingly expensive, yet their treasuries held very little actual gold. And so, in a sudden burst of genius, politicians from both sides discovered a universal trick, so simple even a child could do it. Print money. In the North, the government issued green-inked paper currency known as greenbacks. They told the public, hey, this paper can't be exchanged for gold right now, but it is backed by the promise of the great United States. At first, people were thrilled, holding crisp new bills still smelling of fresh ink, feeling their patriotism surge. But alas, while patriotism is infinite, the value of paper money is very much limited. The more money they printed to buy guns and warships, the thinner each greenback became. Inflation began to gnaw at the pockets of Northerners, causing faith in the government's promise to wobble with every new printing run. However, if the North only had a financial flu, the South, the Confederacy, was truly in a death throes state. Desperate due to resource shortages and blockades, the Southern government let their printing presses run until they literally overheated. They printed graybacks in such astronomical quantities that inflation reached near impossible levels, thousands of %. Imagine this witty yet bitter scene. Southern families having to haul an entire wheelbarrow full of cash just to exchange it for a single loaf of dry bread. By 1865, as the war concluded, the South's currency didn't just weaken, it officially logged out of the financial world, turning into piles of scrap paper, nothing more and nothing less. People were stunned to realize that for years they had worked tirelessly to accumulate a collection of scrap paper featuring portraits of famous figures. Once again, history used a stinging slap to teach us a bloody lesson. True protection never comes from blindly trusting colorful pieces of paper in your wallet, no matter how glamorously they are labeled with patriotism or freedom. While ordinary citizens watched their life savings vanish like smoke, the opportunists, those who owned land, gold, food, or essential goods, were the ones who survived most brilliantly. And just when we thought the lessons of the 19th century were enough to wake humanity up, history continues to deal new hands, more sophisticated and global in scale. Let's step into episode 6 to see how, in the 21st century, this conflict-addicted financial machine has turned into an entity that never sleeps, quietly draining your wallet right under your nose. Leaving behind the scrap paper of the Civil War era, where money was used more for lighting stoves than for shopping, let's take a giant leap through time to land in the present. Welcome to the era of digital digits, where money no longer needs to be printed to become worthless. At this final stop, we will witness a much more sophisticated trap, an incredibly expensive invoice titled Debt in Someone Else's Currency. This is a trap that doesn't require noisy money printing presses. It operates silently through shifting numbers on a screen. Look at the 1997 Asian financial crisis, or, most recently, the disaster in Lebanon starting in 2019. The script plays out like a horror movie for investors, but the setting is right inside your own wallet. These nations committed a classic blunder. They overborrowed in foreign currencies, usually US dollars, and confidently believed they could control the game. When things were going well, the system looked stable and trustworthy. But when the wind changes direction, confidence evaporates and investors flee, these countries realize with a shock that they owe a currency they cannot print themselves. The result is a collapse as swift as a sandcastle before an ocean wave. In Lebanon, people woke up one morning to a scene straight out of a movie. The banks were closed. Small-time savers, doctors, engineers, and retirees suddenly discovered that their life savings had been frozen. Those who placed absolute faith in the system found their savings frozen, harder than ice in a freezer. The Lebanese pound lost over 90% of its value, turning decades of hard work into pocket change, barely enough to buy a few scraps of bread. People waited in long, hopeless lines, begging to withdraw their own money, but the answer they received was either a terrifying silence or cold explanations that the money is no longer there. This is the final blood and bone lesson that history wants to slap across our faces to wake us up. Money in the bank is not actually yours. Legally and practically, it is a loan you have granted to the bank. In a financial world fraught with risk, these institutions always reserve the right to temporarily forget to pay you back when they hit a rough patch. When the illusion of stability shatters, you will find yourself standing alone at a ruthless banquet. A banquet where you are both the person paying the bill and the main course on the table. The question now is, how do you avoid becoming the main course for the financial elite? The answer doesn't lie in how many digits you have on your phone screen, but in whether you own real value. To survive these cyclical pitfalls, you must learn to diversify. Keep some physical gold as an emergency brake, and own some tangible real estate. But most importantly, and this is the ultimate secret, possess practical skills that society will always need. Why are skills so important? Even when currency devalues, even when the numbers in the bank vanish, the human stomach still knows hunger. And when it's hungry, society will always need bakers, farmers, and repairmen. Those who survive and thrive after every crisis are not just those with gold, but those who can create value when the system no longer functions. A person's intrinsic value is something that cannot be diluted by a printing press. Our journey of following the money concludes with a message that is both brutal and hopeful. The financial system always tends to collapse, but those who are well prepared will always find opportunity in the ashes. True wealth does not lie in promises on paper, but in resilience, the liquidity of real assets, and the wisdom to see through financial illusions. Keep a cool head to see the truth, a warm heart to avoid panic, and especially keep your skills sharp to always remain the master of your own financial destiny. Remember, history doesn't repeat itself, but it always rehearses the old lessons for those who haven't bothered to memorize them. Don't wait until the final invoice arrives to start learning how to count the cost.